Real-Time 1960s presents Evening Report, a complete roundup of today's news with Joe Rubenstein.
Good evening. In Washington, President Kennedy speaks out on the New York newspaper strike. In South Vietnam, new rules of engagement are announced. In Los Angeles, a TV writer brutally murders his wife. Comedian Lenny Bruce is arrested. An NBA referee is attacked. And Frank Robinson has a brand new contract. Those are the headlines. The details after this message.
Have you reached the point with your present cigarette where those puffs occasionally taste too harsh, too rough? Then now's the time to change. To Kent.
Treat your taste kindly with Kent. Smoke Kent, the micronite filter cigarette.
In Saigon today, U.S. military sources revealed that American soldiers in South Vietnam will now be allowed, in some cases, to shoot first without waiting to be fired upon by the communist Viet Cong. This change in policy is aimed at checking the mounting U.S. casualty rate in that war. Just yesterday, an American machine gunner with the 81st Helicopter Company was killed when guerrillas shot down 2 helicopters on a medical evacuation flight 100 miles east of Saigon. The gunner, whose name is being withheld pending notification of kin, was the 62nd U.S. serviceman killed in South Vietnam. At the same time, civilian casualties there are being partially attributed to airstrikes by American planes with U.S. pilots. Some officials in Saigon are questioning whether the effectiveness of these strikes aimed at the Viet Cong is outweighed by the accidental killing and wounding of civilians. The fact that the guerrillas emplace themselves among women and children increases the general risk. These civilian deaths are politically damaging as well, as the Viet Cong have been telling peasants that the quote-unquote rain of death from the skies is America's special contribution to the war. Village posters depicting casualties from the strikes emphasize planes with U.S. markings. On other posters, American servicemen are portrayed as looters and rapists. Meanwhile, a Senate study group warned today that the war in South Vietnam was fast becoming an American war and that this could not be justified by U.S. security interests in the region. The group, led by Senator Mike Mansfield, called for, quote, a thorough reassessment of our overall security requirements on the Southeast Asian mainland, unquote, with a view toward the orderly reduction of U.S. aid programs. Mr. Mansfield said, quote, what is most disturbing is that Vietnam now appears to be only at the beginning of coping with its grave inner problems. All the current difficulties existed in 1955, along with the hope and energy to meet them. Now, it is 8 years later and $2 billion of U.S. aid later, yet the same difficulties remain, if indeed they have not been compounded, unquote. At his press conference Thursday, President Kennedy denounced the newspaper blackout in New York City. For 78 days, a printer strike has kept the city's 9 major papers shut down, and there is no end in sight. The points of contention between the printers and the publishers are wages, working conditions, and the workers' fear that automation of printing presses will reduce jobs. On Thursday, the president opened his conference with a statement on the subject in which he criticized the head of the striking printers union, Bertram Powers.
The New York newspaper strike is now in its 75th day. The situation has long since passed the point of public toleration. The essence of free collective bargaining in this country is a sense of responsibility and restraint by both sides, not merely an effort by one side or the other to break those who sit across the bargaining table from them. It is clear in the case of the New York newspaper strike that the local of the International Typographical Union and its president, Bertram Powers, insofar as anyone can understand his position, are attempting to impose a settlement which could shut down several newspapers in New York and throw thousands out of work. Collective bargaining has failed. The most intensive mediation has failed. This is a situation which is bad for the union movement all over the country, bad for the newspaper managements, and bad for the New York citizens, more than 5 million of them, who are newspaper readers. In my view, one solution to this prolonged strike, if no immediate progress is made, would be for the striking printers, companies, and other involved unions to submit their differences to independent determination of some kind. I cannot see any other alternative which at present would bring about a solution to this critical labor dispute, which has already had a vital effect on the economic life of this great city of New York.
Later in the conference, President Kennedy was asked if he saw the need for legislation in matters such as this to serve the public interest.
I don't think that today we ought to consider compulsory arbitration. As I've said before, this is a matter which involves a community, a city. It's not a national issue. It doesn't affect the national health and safety. And I think the best solution is for the union to demonstrate a sense of responsibility and not merely try to carry this to its final ultimate of cracking the publishers, because if they do it, they will close down some papers and I think will hurt their employment possibilities themselves. I think the best thing now to see if we can get a third party in who can move perhaps a step beyond mediation, but still perhaps not to the final step of arbitration, which, as you say, historically they've been unwilling to accept.
Earlier today, New York Mayor Robert Wagner met with Mr. Powers for several hours, and he later met with the publishers as well. Also today, New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller appeared on television and said the following, quote, "The situation is so tragic and so critical from an economic point of view that if Mayor Wagner is not successful in his effort to mediate the strike, I will have to consider a board of inquiry. We have arrived at the end of the road. This thing cannot go any further," unquote. Whatever news management may be, President Kennedy was accused of it Thursday and then asked to define it as well. His accuser was 73-year-old May Craig, originally from South Carolina and now a correspondent for a group of newspapers in Maine. Halfway through the conference, she outshouted her male colleagues and asked the following question.
Mr. President, the practice of managed news is attributed to your administration. Mr. Salinger says he's never had it defined. Will you give us your definition and ask us why you find it necessary to practice it?
You are charging us with something, Miss Gray, and then you're asking me to define what it is you're charging me with. I think you might. Let me just say that we've had very limited success in managing the news, if that's what we've been trying to do. And perhaps you'd tell us what it is that you object to in our treatment of the news.
Are you asking me
Yes.
something? Well, I don't believe in managed news at all. I thought we ought to get everything we want.
Well, I think you should too, Miss Gray. I'm for that.
I'll have more news for you after this message.
Cats certainly know how to be good for people. And people can be pretty good for cats, too. Especially by feeding them Puss in Boots, either new meat flavor or original fish formula. Cats need basic nutrients in different quantities from other pets. Puss in Boots is formulated especially for cats. Once a day, every day, for lifelong nutrition, feed your cat Puss in Boots. You'll soon see how a proper diet builds better health and happier dispositions.
Here again, Joe Rubenstein.
In Los Angeles this morning, funeral services were held for Mrs. Dolores Heidemann, 32 years old. At the same time, preparations were being made to charge her husband Leonard, a prominent 35-year-old television writer, with her murder. As the services were being conducted by Rabbi Julian Feingold, Mr. Heidemann, who has written scripts for Highway Patrol, Have Gun Will Travel, and Bonanza, remained locked in a cell at West Valley Police Station. At 6 a.m. Friday in Tarzana, the Heidemann's 5-year-old son Richard ran to a neighbor's home and told them, quote, "There's blood all over, and Daddy is hurting Mommy." The neighbors, who'd already been awakened by the sound of screaming, called the police. When the police arrived at the Heidemann's $50,000 home, they found Mrs. Heidemann lying in the threshold between the kitchen and the dining room, the double handle of a pair of kitchen shears protruding from her chest. At that point, Mr. Heidemann, completely nude and with his hands bleeding profusely from cuts, walked into the room. Although he was not able to give a coherent account of what had happened, Mr. Heidemann did admit the stabbing, telling police, quote, "I had a dream. I was acting out the dream. I went out of my mind. If only I could turn back the clock. We have to go on a trip today," unquote. Mr. Heidemann then told the police he had taken a large quantity of pills before the slaying. He was taken to Northridge Hospital, where his stomach was pumped and 22 stitches were taken in his hands and fingers. Later, during his interrogation at the police station, Mr. Heidemann suddenly stopped, looked around, and said, quote, "I've written this scene before." The Heidemann's 2 children, 5-year-old Richard and 4-year-old Kenneth, have been turned over to the late Mrs. Heidemann's parents. Dr. No, the sixth of Ian Fleming's James Bond novels to be published, but the first to be filmed, will soon be followed on the big screen by Mr. Fleming's From Russia with Love. Dr. No had its British premiere in October and is set for release here in May. From Russia with Love begins shooting March 25th in London, with additional location shooting in Istanbul and Venice. Sean Connery will again play the role of Secret Service Agent 007, James Bond. The producers, Harry Saltzman and Albert Bercoli, are still testing actresses for the Russian lead character, described in Mr. Fleming's novel as a voluptuous young Greta Garbo. In a recent interview, Mr. Fleming was asked if he had had the Bond character in mind for some time before he wrote Casino Royale, the first Bond novel, in 1952.
No, I can't say I had, really. He sort of developed when I was just on the edge of getting married, and I was frenzied at the prospect of this great step in my life after having been a bachelor for so long, and I really wanted to take my mind off the agony, and so I decided to sit down and write a book.
He was asked if Bond was based on a particular person.
No, not really. He's a sort of fictional mixture of commandos and Secret Service agents that I met during the war, but of course entirely fictionalized. People do connect me with James Bond simply because I happen to like scrambled eggs and short-sleeved shirts and some of the things that James Bond does, but I certainly haven't got his guts nor his very lively appetites.
The author responded to the charge that the torture scenes in his books were sadistic.
Well, I don't know how many of them you've read, but of course they're nothing to what they really are in real life. And I think the old days of the hero getting a crack over the head with a cricket stump have rather gone out. I mean, we all have become considerably wiser since the last war. And I've tried to bring verisimilitude into these books, and it's certainly true that the critics have occasionally found them pretty strong meat. But I was brought up on what we used to call fourpenny horrors, and I can't remember that any of the excitements ever did me any harm. All history is sex and violence, and I think it's ridiculous to go on writing thrillers in the old Bulldog Drummond, John Buchan way when life has come out so fast past us.
Finally, Mr. Fleming was asked if writing a Bond book every year was keeping him from quote-unquote more serious writing.
No, I'm not in the Shakespeare stakes. I've got no ambitions.
Among the many fans of Mr. Fleming's novels is President Kennedy, who enjoyed a private screening of Dr. No at the White House in December. Afterward, the president reportedly said, quote, "I wish I had James Bond on my staff." In Los Angeles yesterday morning, Lenny Bruce was arrested on suspicion of possessing heroin. The so-called sick comedian's arrest came shortly after he had arrived by plane from Chicago. Police said they stopped the taxi in which Mr. Bruce was riding because one of its headlights was out. The officers found a gram of heroin in a knotted balloon on the back seat and syringes and bottles of drugs in a small suitcase. They also observed fresh needle marks on the comedian's right arm. Mr. Bruce, who lives on Hollywood Boulevard, told the arresting officers the drugs were prescriptions for an illness. He was released on bond yesterday afternoon. Mr. Bruce faces trial March 4th on a separate narcotics charge and has 2 additional court appearances pending. One for allegedly using obscene language in his nightclub act, the other for punching a TV cameraman. Sports, right after this.
It wasn't chance that built America. It was strong backs, skilled hands, and keen minds. Today we'll need more keen minds with the best possible college training, but shortages are closing in around our colleges. The cost of leadership is going up. Give to the college of your choice. To learn more about the college crisis, write to Higher Education, Box 36, Times Square Station, New York 36, New York.
At the Los Angeles Sports Arena tonight, spectacular defense from center Bill Russell and torrid shooting from Tommy Heinsohn and Sam Jones enabled the Boston Celtics to crush the Los Angeles Lakers 119-109. Russell blocked over a dozen shots and scored 22 points before coach Red Auerbach took him out of the game with 5 minutes remaining. Late in the second quarter, Los Angeles fans became enraged when referee Norm Drucker failed to call time after Laker Jim Krebs was clobbered going in for a layup and crashed to the floor. As Krebs lay in pain, Drucker allowed play to continue, and the Celtics scored twice. Some unruly fans behind the press table had some choice words for the referee, and the situation escalated after the halftime intermission. As Drucker was leaving his dressing room, several Laker fans cornered and trapped him. Drucker later reported he had been punched and kicked, while the fans claimed the referee had thrown the first punch. Either way, Drucker officiated the second half without incident, and there were no arrests. Despite a dismal performance by the Lakers, who at one point in the third quarter trailed by 30, the crowd never gave up, cheering their heroes on until finally, the home team started to surge in the fourth quarter, cutting the deficit to 9. However, Tommy Heinsohn killed their hopes by dropping in 3 consecutive hook shots from crazy angles, and the issue was settled. It was Bob Cousy's final scheduled game in Los Angeles, but the Celtics may return during the playoffs. Russell, in addition to his 22 points, had 17 rebounds. A former basketball teammate of Russell's at McClymonds High School in Oakland worked out today at the Cincinnati Reds training camp in Tampa, Florida. That former teammate is Frank Robinson, 27-year-old star outfielder whose new $60,000 contract makes him the highest-paid player in Reds history. This afternoon, Reds manager Fred Hutchinson said, quote, "Robbie isn't just a good ball player, he's one of the greatest in the history of the game. There isn't anything he doesn't do well," unquote. Despite a slow start last April, Robinson led the majors with a .624 slugging percentage last year. He hit 39 homers, 4th best in the majors, led the league with 51 doubles, drove in 136 runs, good for 3rd place, and his .342 batting average was second only to Tommy Davis of the Dodgers, who hit .346. Today, Robinson was asked how he would advise a youngster who sought his advice on hitting.
Try not to copy anyone, be themselves naturally. Get a bat that feels good to them, and get in the batter's box, take a good stance, real loose, be up there, and try not to overswing. They don't have to swing from the end of the bat either. They can choke up on the bat and still hit the long ball or the home run, as kids try to do. And that's all I say. Try not to copy one. As long as you can be yourself, you'll be that much better off.
He was asked the same question about fielding.
Fielding, I'd say get a glove that's big enough for the outfield, not one of the smaller infield gloves. And think ahead. Think if the ball is hit to me, what am I going to do with it before it's hit to you? And if it is hit to you, you'll react automatically.
Finally, Robinson was asked what Bill Russell was like in high school.
He was a real good defensive player in high school. He was 6'7.5", and that was real big for high school then. He was a little awkward around, trying to score and move around the floor, but he was a real good defensive ball player then. You could see that he was going to be a real good ball player once he had his coordination and everything down. His first year in college, he really came on like a house of fire. Everything clicked, and from there, he just went to the sky was the limit for him.
And finally tonight, fight fans who wish to see Cassius Clay in action against Doug Jones March 13th, but cannot make it to Madison Square Garden, may be able to see the fight broadcast live at their local movie theater, depending on where they live. David Wallerstein, president of the Balaban and Katz movie theater chain, was the first to sign for the closed-circuit telecast of the bout. The fight will be screened at dozens of theatrical locations around the country, so check your local listings. Tickets are priced at $4. In addition, the nation's first pay TV experiment, Hartford Subscription TV, which debuted last year, has contracted to show the contest. Clay has already predicted a 6th-round knockout victory, but this week he threatened to cut it to 4 if Jones annoyed him. And that, for this evening, completes our look at the latest news on this Sunday, February 24th, 1963. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day tomorrow.
This has been your Evening Report, a roundup of the latest news with Joe Rubenstein.